It's certainly a departure from the normal turn of diplomacy. Usually,
why do you say that?
Because a summit, usually the lower level diplomats hammer out what will be decided ahead of time, and they go into the summit knowing the outcome. Here, nobody knows what to expect, least of all Trump. And that is not a very good place to be. We want to know. We don't like the feeling of insecurity. So I think Trump is thinking about this not as a summit, but in a different way. Just like, let me talk to him, see what he's thinking, kind of get the sense of things and see if I can make some progress. So for Trump, it's very typical for his kind of a sort of shoot from the hip personal relations approach, but it's not what international diplomats would expect from a summit.
How would you categorize the current status of the Trump and Putin relationship, particularly because heading into this meeting, there's a lot of columnists out there who are calling this already a diplomatic win for Putin just because he's coming on U.S. soil and just because he's agreed to this meeting? Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say that it's a win. I don't love that term, but it's a win in the sense that this is a war not just on the battlefield, but it's a war of narratives. And Russia's narrative is that Ukraine is not a country. And Ukrainians are not a people, they're not a nation. And by not having Ukraine at the table, at the summit, and instead having the US, it feeds that narrative. Like, they're not here because they're not a country. Zelensky's not here because he's not a legitimate leader of a country. And in fact, for Russia, and for Putin especially, Ukraine is part of Russia. So that's the narrative he's pushing. And the summit kind of feeds into that. And it's a win in the sense that Putin can take that message to his population. He can take it to other audiences around the world, like North Korea, like Iran, like China, and say, look, I'm a superpower. Russia's back in the game. We were a superpower, and we're a superpower again.
Elise, how much of this is about optics, certainly for President Trump as well as President Putin, in terms of European leaders watching, China watching, Iran watching? Like, I just think about, how important it is in terms of how this comes out for each of these leaders, and how they are perceived around the world.
I think what I was talking about, definitely is about optics for Russia. Even though it's an authoritarian country, they have to be somewhat concerned about what the population thinks. And lately, Ukraine has been taking the war to Russia and disrupting flights. Even some civilians have been killed. Well, not many civilians. I would say there's been some activity on the territory of Russia, and that makes the war less popular. So it's optics, but it's also, I think that Putin is really trying to get something out of the U.S., trying to convince Trump, that Russia's position is the correct one. And if he can do that, he would make a lot in today.
Meaning the position of a land grab?
Yeah.
Because he already succeeded with the Crimean Peninsula back in 2014. And so here it is, a second one. So is that the end game for him, to kind of get back? It's not an expansion of territory as he sees it. It's going back to land that used to belong to
So that's his claim, that this land used to belong.
Right,
Yeah.
that's his claim.
So part of this is about territory, and that's certainly one of the demands, of Russia's demands, that they're asking for territory, and they're even making the outrageous claim that they want some of the territory that they don't even control militarily,
right,
in Donetsk and in some of the other areas in the east. But there's also a political demand, also outrageous, and that political demand is that Ukraine cannot join the West, it cannot join NATO, and it cannot join Europe. So again, it's saying Ukraine is not a country. It doesn't have the right to make sovereign decisions for itself.
We are talking with Elise Giuliano. She's senior lecturer in political science at Columbia University. So having said that, will anything in your view come out of this meeting? If that is the position of President Putin, that's a tough one for the U.S. to even maybe concede to, potentially.
It's something the U.S. should not concede, and you use the right term there, because it would be a massive concession, and that's not a place we want to be, right? We want to be defending state sovereignty. We want to be defending a European ally, Ukraine. I think that the U.S., though, really has leverage, and Trump really needs to use that leverage, and he started to. He put 50% tariff on India for buying Russian oil and gas. And there's a lot of leverage. Like, let's keep in mind that Russia's economy is the size of Italy, and that was before the sanctions. So there's a lot more the U.S. can do in terms of sanctions. There's a lot more the U.S. can do in terms of armaments and military support for Ukraine.
And we, Emily, as you know, at Bloomberg, have done a lot of reporting about the Russian economy that's really stalling because of that diminishing oil revenue. So he is in economically a tight spot.
Yeah, to what extent does that help Trump and the U.S. here and actually finding some success out of this summit?
I think if the U.S. and if Trump realizes that Russia is not the Soviet Union, I mean, it does have nuclear weapons, and this is a a difficult point, but
it has a lot of nuclear weapons.
It does, and I think that's why the Biden administration was so cautious in its support for Ukraine. But I think that understanding Russia's economy and, in fact, that its GDP is dropping and that it's in a tough spot would help the U.S. to understand the forms of leverage it has. So it could really turn the screws. And I think Trump is coming around to this.
The President Trump could have turned the screws last Friday, right? There was a sanctions deadline that came and went.
Exactly, with no comment by Trump.
Exactly.
Right. So it's interesting that instead of commenting on this, on the possibility of further sanctions for China or for India, these secondary sanctions, instead they said, oh, let's have a bilateral summit, which just seems like a gift for Putin. So this is why Europe and I think Ukraine have been a bit nervous about the outcome of this summit.
Is there a possibility at all then, in your view, that Zelensky does get to join a meeting? Maybe not this one, but maybe in the future, particularly if Putin is deliberately trying to not have him included in these talks.
And President Trump seemed to indicate that European allies could come in, or President Zelensky.
Right.
So Trump understands now that it's important for Europe and Ukraine to have a seat at the table in its own war. But I think the problem...
You smile when you say that, but it is kind of crazy when we think about it. But go ahead.
It is. But I think the problem, again, is Putin. He has never recognized Zelensky as the legitimate elected leader of Ukraine. And so to sit across, for Putin to sit across the table from Zelensky gives Ukraine as a state legitimacy. It gives Zelensky legitimacy, and that undercuts the narrative of Ukraine being, again, an illegitimate state and part of Russia.
You are a study of Russia, and I feel like we can study countries, but we can study leaders, and they tell us so much. What do we need to understand about Vladimir Putin?
Well, Putin is a very transactional leader, although in this case...
So it's a good match.
It can be a good match, and that's why you see the summit happening also, right? Because we hear that Russia is coming with the idea of selling the U.S. on some economic deals, right? So they kind of see that they can do business with Trump. But at the same time, I think we really do need to understand that Putin has been intransigent from the beginning of this war in terms of Ukraine. He doesn't always know it seems that he doesn't always know what's going on the battlefield, and he is committed. And they have said there's not going to be anything signed out of this meeting. They said it. So there's not going to be a ceasefire. There's not going to be a kind of agreement. Perhaps the most we can hope for is a continuation of conversation, and perhaps Russia realizing that the Trump administration will start to exert the leverage that it does have.